Hi, welcome everybody. Sorry about that. We were having a sound problem, but I'm glad you stuck around. My name is Carter. I'm a marketing manager here with ExamSoft, and I just wanted to introduce Sonya Sedivy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She works for the Center for Placement Testing, and much of her research is focused on determining the effectiveness of current methods for detecting differential item functioning under realistic data conditions. I'm sure she can shed some more light on that as she goes along in her webinar. I just wanted to let y'all know there is a panel in your GoToWebinar little box that you'll have on your screen. If you want to write questions, type as many in there as you need, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the webinar. Without further ado, I'm going to open this up to Sonya.
All right, thank you, Carter. Like Carter said, my name is Sonya, and I am a psychometrician at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I work in our Center for Placement Testing, where we develop and administer tests to incoming freshmen to determine which course is best suited for them to begin in math, English, and 3 foreign languages. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how to write effective test questions. And so we'll talk a little about what types of questions can be answered by testing. Talk about a test blueprint, different types of multiple choice items, and give some guidelines for writing those items, and then what are some reasons why we should use these guidelines. So we're all here because we engage in some form of testing. This may be classroom testing, perhaps you do admissions testing or placement testing like I do, or licensure and certification, and this is just a few different realms where testing is used. And the reason we test is because it can really help us to answer some important questions from multiple perspectives. So if I'm an instructor, testing may help me to know if my students are understanding the concepts. They can help me to understand if maybe I can introduce this topic more effectively. And it can also help me understand if my course might need to be revised next time. Maybe I need to introduce topics in a different order. Or maybe one topic is not as important as it used to be due to different trends in my individual field. For a student, testing can help answer whether or not they're mastering the course content. It can help a student know if they need to spend more time studying. And ultimately, what we know they are all really just interested in is what grade are they earning in the course. From some other perspectives, like for what I do, testing helps us answer which course is most appropriate for an individual freshman to start their college career. If we're doing licensure or certification testing, testing can help answer whether or not a candidate should be eligible for certification. And these are just a few questions that testing can answer. However, if these questions are going to be answered effectively, the tests that we're administering must be both reliable and valid. And our first step in creating a reliable and valid test is really to develop quality test questions. And when we say quality test questions or test items, we really mean that these items are easily understood, that they're measuring relevant content, and that they can discriminate between examinees who have a high level of the content knowledge versus those who maybe have a lower level of the content knowledge. But before we can even start writing test questions, first we want to develop a test blueprint. The test blueprint identifies the objectives or the skills that we think are important or what we want to measure on our test. And it also assigns a relative weight to these objectives. And we'll see an example here on the next slide. The test blueprint is really an important guide that you can use when you're writing your test questions. First off, it helps to ensure that you actually write items to cover all of the relevant content, to measure everything that it is that you want to look at. Generally, we find that if we develop a test and we haven't used a test blueprint, we end up with a lot of items, maybe on only 1 or 2 of our content areas, because it was just really easy to write those test items. So we end up with too many items in certain areas and not enough in the others. So the test blueprint can help guide you with that. It also is useful if you want to develop alternate forms. Maybe you want to give one form of the test to your first class and a second form of the test to your second class. Or one group of examinees is going to get Form A, another group is going to get Form B. The test blueprint ensures that you build both of those two tests to the same specifications. And most importantly, this test blueprint is our first step towards developing content validity. Is our test actually measuring what we want it to measure? So this is a sample blueprint from actually our basic math section of our math test here in the office. And you'll see on the left-hand column each individual objective or the skill that we want to test is listed. And then in the right-hand column, we have the percentage of the test that will fall under each of these objectives. So for example, we say that 5% of our test should come from integer arithmetic. So we're talking about a 20-item test. This means that we're only going to have one item that measures integer arithmetic. On the other hand, we say that 20% of our test is going to measure rational and decimal arithmetic, or if we're talking 20 items, that means 4 of the items on our test will measure rational and decimal arithmetic. We're giving more weight to this objective. If the objective carries more weight, it means that we should probably write more test questions on it. When you're developing this test blueprint, you can weigh all of your objectives equally. However, as you see here, what we usually do is we give different weight to different objectives depending on maybe we think one objective is important, but we know we can measure it easily with just 1 or 2 questions. Or if we're talking about classroom testing, maybe I've spent a lot of the class time discussing one given topic. This might be something that I might want to weigh a little more and have more items on it. When you're thinking this up, the first thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that that right-hand column adds up to 100%, so you're measuring 100% of your test. When writing the objectives, you want to make sure that they are specific enough to allow you to write items that actually measure that given skill, but they want to be general enough that you can write multiple test items for any given objective. So for example, if I had a test objective that says that I want to test that a student knows that 5 plus 5 equals 10, this is too specific. I really only have one way of testing that. I could only write one item, and this is it. 5 plus 5 equals 10. So instead, I may want my objective to be whole number arithmetic. I can write multiple math items that measure whether or not a student or an examinee can add whole numbers. On the other hand, having an objective that just is entitled graphing might be too general. I may want to split this out into different types of graphs. So maybe I have graphs of linear functions or line, being able to graph a line. And then I also maybe have graphs of trigonometry functions. So when you're developing this test blueprint, you first want to decide what your objectives or the skills that you want to measure, what those are, and then you want to determine the relative weight of each objective. How many questions on your test do you want to measure each one of these? And more important objectives, things that you think are more important, should carry more weight, and you should have more items. Then you can start writing your test questions. When you write your test questions, it's important to kind of keep track of which objective each of these items is measuring. This will help you to keep track of how many questions you have for each objective. So if I know I need 5 items that measure whole integer arithmetic and I only have 3, I need to write at least 2 more items. It can also help you if you plan to reuse the items in the future and build multiple tests based on these items. That way you've already identified the objective. You can easily search for it and pull items as necessary. And this is what item categories in SoftTeach can help with. This is what we use it for in our office. So categories in SoftTeach, you can actually assign an unlimited number of categories to each question. And maybe you want to assign them based on Bloom's taxonomy, on your specific learning outcomes for your class. Maybe you have institutional or program level accreditation standards that you want to assign to it. And then later, you can generate reports based solely on one given category if you would like to. What I use categories for in SoftTeach is to actually help build my tests. So if I know on our English test that I need to have 10 items that measure parallelism and subordination, I click on the categories option up in the top of SoftTeach and I browse categories. And then in the left-hand pane, I can select parallelism and subordination. And in the right hand, every single test item that we have that falls under that category will pop up. Then I can simply just pick and choose the ones that I want. And if I know I need 10 of them, I can pull 10 items out of here. It's very, very handy for test building. When you're building your test blueprint, you can include different types of items in here. Maybe you know that you want to have 2 essay questions, and the rest you want to be multiple choice, or you want a certain percentage of them to be true, false. You can build that into your test blueprint as well. Today, however, we're going to talk primarily about multiple choice and true, false items. And one of the reasons for this is because multiple choice items really have some pretty good benefits. The first is they're generally easy to construct. It's usually pretty easy to write multiple choice questions. Multiple choice questions are also highly efficient. We can administer them to a large group easily in comparison to, say, giving an oral examination or something that needs to be done one-on-one. They're also easily scored in comparison to, say, an essay exam where you need to spend quite a bit of time reading through individual essays and scoring them based on whatever your rubric is. Multiple choice questions are also objectively scored, which eliminates rater effects. So if I give a multiple choice test and my colleague gives the same multiple choice test to a different group of test takers, the grading is very objective. Either the answer is right or wrong, and it's not going to matter which one of us gave the test. And ultimately, all 3 of these things means that exams based on multiple choice questions often are going to result in reliable tests. This is not always the case, but it's going to be a good step in the right direction for having a reliable test. Multiple choice items really contain 3 main components. The first is the item stem, and this is the stimulus for the response. It's usually an incomplete sentence that we want the test taker to complete, or it's a question that we would like answered. The second component is the key, or the correct answer. And then we have item distractors, or the incorrect alternatives. And this is usually the most difficult part of the item to write. However, whether or not a multiple choice item is doing what it's supposed to do and you have an effective test item very much depends on you having strong distractors. You need to have 1 or 2 options, good incorrect alternatives, in order to have an effective question. There are many different types of multiple choice items, and today we're just going to talk about a few of the most common ones, and then we'll move into giving some guidelines for writing them. Okay. The most traditional type of multiple choice items is the correct answer format, where one alternative is unambiguously correct and the others are unambiguously or incorrect. It's a very straightforward type of multiple choice item, and therefore it's usually the easiest to write. So for example, this question only has 1 correct answer. 10 plus 5 is only 15, and the rest of the options are incorrect. Another format is the best answer format, and here all of the alternatives contain answers that may be correct to a varying degree, or they could just be completely wrong. And then examinees are asked to select an answer that is the most nearly correct. This type of answer often involves a matter of opinion. So for example, the best president to take office after the year 1900 was. Now, we can all probably sit and have a discussion about who we think may be the correct answer, and I'm willing to bet that some of us could come up with arguments made for all of these individuals. So it's better to put in a qualifier or state the source that's actually making the claim that this is the best president after the year 1900. So a better option is going to be, according to Newsweek, the the best president to take office after the year 1900 was. And in this case, Newsweek said it is Franklin Roosevelt. A third type of multiple choice item is the multiple response format. This is where we may have more than one correct answer, and we ask the test taker to select all that apply or to identify all of the correct options. And we can really think of this as a series of true-false questions. So here's an example. Which of the following are members of the canine family? Select all that apply. The examinee is asked to select all of them that are members of the canine family. And here, and most of these items, you'll see that I've marked the correct answer with an asterisk. Another type of multiple choice item is the negative format, and this is the one where examinees are asked to select the alternative that is incorrect. Generally, we want to avoid using this type of item. Negatively worded stems sometimes can be very confusing for examinees. However, there are instances in which this type of item may be useful. Perhaps a situation where there are multiple good answers, and so it's easy, you would like the student to identify the one that is not a very good answer. We find that these items sometimes are useful on our math test. If you are going to use this format of item, you must make it obvious to the examinee that you're really interested in the wrong answer. It's helpful to bold, underline, or do all caps of the negative word. And you also want to try to place that negative word, the accept or not, as close to the end of the stem as possible. So you'll see on this item, the word accept is the very last word in the stem. Our recommendation is to try and write a positively stated item stem first. And if you find that you simply cannot do it and it still is a very, very important item, then you can try writing the negative format and follow these guidelines. Okay. One of the most complex types of multiple choice items is the combined response or the complex format. And this is where we give a series of statements and the examinee is asked to identify the relationship between the statements. Many people have suggested that this type of multiple choice item often gets at a more complex thought process. However, this item is generally pretty difficult to construct, and it may be more susceptible to test-taking skills. For example, on this item, if I know that number 2 is not correct, I can automatically rule out options B, C, and E. And now I only have options A and D to choose from. Our final type of multiple choice item is the true-false format, which simply is a multiple choice item that only has 2 alternatives, and they've already been defined for you. You don't need to write a distractor and a key. It's either going to be true or false. This is a very popular type of item with classroom testing, and generally they can be pretty easy to write. However, it's important to note that these true-false items may be more susceptible to guessing, since there's only 2 options to choose from, or just simply recall. We want to be careful not to use double-barreled statements or statements that have 2 meanings. And this is something that we want to watch for in all types of multiple choice items. They just tend to crop up a little bit more with true-false statements. So for example, yoga is an effective and enjoyable form of exercise. True or false? This item is double-barreled because I may think that yoga is effective but not enjoyable, or I may think it's enjoyable but not effective. It's really asking 2 things. So we want to make sure that our items are not trying to measure too much at one time. So these are some of the most common formats of multiple choice items, and now we're going to move into some guidelines and rules for writing them. And you're going to find that some of these guidelines are rather straightforward and others may not be, and that really the majority of these rules deal with making the item as clear and concise as possible. And that's due to because we would like to work towards what we call the testing ideal. And in the testing ideal, every examinee fully understands the question. They fully understand what is being asked of them. And the examinees who know the answer will get the item correct, and the examinees who do not know the answer will get the item incorrect. Most of these rules, they're all for multiple choice items. Most of them will also apply to true-false items. The exception is if we are talking about any of the distractors or the incorrect options. Since a true-false is simply the answer is either true or false, anything talking about the distractor will not apply there. First off, each item should really only test one specific content area. This is another place where your test blueprint comes in handy. An item should really only be assigned to one objective on that given blueprint. We want to express the item as clearly as possible. We don't want to use ambiguous language. Ambiguous items are not going to discriminate well, meaning that they're not going to be able to differentiate between examinees who do well on the test or who really know the content versus examinees who don't do as well on the test or don't know the content as well. We really want the difficulty of our item to arise due to the content and not because of the wording of the test. If it's due to the wording, it's likely that that item is going to be misunderstood and that examinees who actually really know the content or should know the answer, they have a higher chance of getting that item wrong simply because they didn't understand what we were asking. We want to choose words with precise meanings, so try to avoid using words such as frequently, good, and often. And we also want to make the item stem as brief as possible. This is just really going to decrease the likelihood of having complex sentences, awkward word arrangements, things that are going to make our item more ambiguous. It's going to increase the likelihood that examinees are going to understand what is being asked of them. We want to follow the standard written rules of English or whatever the languages that you're testing in. So use correct grammar, punctuation, and spelling. Simplify your vocabulary. Reading comprehension should not interfere with the actual content that you're trying to test. And also we want to minimize reading time. The easiest way to do this, as we mentioned in the last slide, is to make the stem as brief as possible. If we increase the reading time, it could lend itself to adding to an increased test fatigue in some of our test takers. We want to avoid using superfluous information because it can really detract from the primary focus of the item and can mislead examinees. So again, it can lead your top examinees or the people who really know the content to getting the item incorrect, which is not what you want. So for example, our tallest president standing at 6'4", Abraham Lincoln, was which president of the United States? I don't need to know that Abraham Lincoln was the tallest president or actually how tall he was in order to answer this question. So it's best to simply remove out that extra information, the lead into the question. It also makes the question a little more clear. We want to be as accurate as possible in all parts of the item. So for example, we do foreign language testing in French, German, and Spanish. And one of our requirements when we're writing test items is that we do not include verb tenses that don't actually exist as distractors. They're often very appealing to examinees that maybe are not as strong in the language, but if it's not a verb tense that actually exists in the language, we won't use it because that's just it's making it inaccurate. We want to make the difficulty of the items appropriate for the group that we're testing. We want to avoid using items that everybody is going to get correct or that only our very, very top examinees are going to get correct. Items that everybody either gets correct or hardly anybody gets correct really do not contribute any extra information to your test. If everybody gets the item right, then it's not going to differentiate between top performing examinees and examinees who perform lower. And if the item is too hard, it's really just going to increase the likelihood that a lot of your examinees are going to guess on it. We know that items where approximately 35% to 85% of examinees get the answer correct are the ones that discriminate the best or can differentiate between different levels of students. So we want to write the majority of our test items to measure what a typical examinee will know, not just the exceptional ones. Your questions should focus on the core content and avoid trivial details. However, whether or not something is trivial, it really is dependent upon the purpose of your test and the population that you're testing. Only you as a content expert, or if you're using subject matter experts to write your items, only they can decide what is trivial and what is core content. So I have an example taken from Halidina, and I'll give you the reference for this book at the end of the presentation, but I really think that this is just an excellent example of this. So the top question, what is the nicotine content of a typical cigarette? If I am testing middle school students in a health class, this might be a trivial item for them to know. It may be better for me to use the second question instead. However, if I'm giving an exam to a college-level public health class, perhaps that top question, what is the nicotine content of a typical cigarette, that might be something that is important for them to know. So only you as the expert or the experts that you're using to help develop your test can really identify what may be trivial versus what might be the really important core content. We want to avoid giving clues to the correct response, and there's actually a number of ways in which we may accidentally give away what the right answer is to our multiple choice items. The first is if we have a pattern among the keyed responses or the correct responses. So if our string of correct responses are E, ABC, 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 examinees are going to pick up on that. Similarly, if we use the correct response too many times in a row, A, B, C, 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 examinees are also going to pick up on that pattern. But mostly what they're going to think is they're going to think to themselves, I've answered C 3 times in a row. There's no way that the next answer is C, and they might actually talk themselves out of what is the correct answer. So one way to avoid this is to first decide the location for your key or your correct answer. Is it going to be A, B, C, D, or E? And then assign the locations for the incorrect answers or the distractors. And we want to use all of our alternatives with approximately the same frequency. Another way that we may give away clues to the correct answer is using incorrect grammatical construction. So if the stem of our item tells you that the answer should be plural, but some of the alternatives are singular, or vice versa, that could give it away. If the alternatives result in sentence fragments or that are the wrong part of speech, that all helps the student identify that perhaps that's not the correct answer. So for example, in the Harry Potter series, Harry's pet is cats. The item stem calls for the answer to be singular and cats is plural. So this automatically tells a student that B is not the correct answer. Or Harry's pet is rat. This results in a sentence fragment since it doesn't say a rat, which is also a clue that that's not the correct answer. Creating items that lack parallel structure in the alternatives is also a way of giving away the correct answer. We want our alternatives to be as homogeneous as possible in terms of content, structure, and length is usually the culprit here. So in the passage, the word jovial most nearly means glum, characterized by a good-spirited humor, and judgmental. Option B is much longer than options A and C, and this is especially problematic because that's the correct answer. So it sticks out and it draws people towards it. We want to avoid repeating words in the stem and in the key. So the sample item. An individual running for President of the United States must meet which of the following criteria? And the correct answer, the president must be 35 years old. It's the only option that has the word president. President also appears in the stem. It gives you a clue that that might be the correct answer. We also want to avoid using interrelated items. Sometimes, inadvertently, one of our items actually gives away the correct answer to another item. So if the first item on our test says Ariel is the main character in which Disney movie, and then later I have a question that starts out, in The Little Mermaid, Ariel, I've now told my examinees which movie Ariel is in, and they can go back to question 1 and get the correct answer, even if they have no idea what the correct answer was. We want to avoid using specific determiners, really strong words such as all, none, or always, and the distractors. Often these are so extreme that examinees can just rule them out right away. So one of the benefits of multiple choice items is that option B, they always result in reliable tests, and students can never guess on them. These are pretty strong statements. Most examinees will rule those out right away. And the final way that we may actually give away clues to the correct response is having synonymous or non-exclusive distractors, or alternatives that actually overlap. This is especially true in the correct answer format, where we're asking examinees to pick the one correct answer. So this first item, the word melancholy, most nearly means happy and cheerful are synonyms. And if the examinee knows that there can only be one correct answer, then they know it can't be both A and D, they can rule those out. Similarly, what was the 2012 top-selling vehicle in the United States? The Honda CR-V is a type of SUV. These are non-exclusive. Again, if the examinee knows there can only be one answer, it can't both be the Honda CR-V and an SUV, so they can rule those out. When we're writing multiple choice questions, we want to be sure that our item stem contains the main idea. This will always be the case in a true-false item, but if you're talking other types of multiple choice questions, examinees shouldn't have to hunt around in the alternatives to understand what exactly the question is asking. They should be able to get that from the item stem. We want to use either a direct question or an incomplete statement as the stem. If it's a true-false item, then we're going to be using a complete statement. We want to provide one response that experts agree is best. We want to remove any chance that there's any opinion in the item. And we saw this way back at the beginning when we were talking about the best answer format, where we asked who was the best president since 1900. There's a lot of opinion based in that question. So if you are going to use them, remember to provide the necessary qualifications or provide the source who's claiming that that was the best. So we rewrote that item to say, according to Newsweek, who was the best president. We also want to avoid a negatively stated stem. Again, we kind of talked about this when we talked about the negative format. If you have to use a negative item format, make sure it's very, very obvious to examinees that you're asking for the incorrect answer or everything except bold, underline, that negative word. That's going to help them understand what exactly it is you're asking. We want to include in the stems any words that we otherwise would just simply be repeating in the alternatives. So in the book The Hobbit, Gandalf slays the dragon, Gandalf finds a magic ring, Gandalf kills the great goblin. Instead of repeating Gandalf every single time in each of the options, we just want to move that up to the top and add it into the item stem. We want to make the distractors plausible to those who lack knowledge. Okay, we want to simulate the common mistakes and the likely errors. And the easiest way to do, or that's the easiest way to do that, is to simulate common mistakes, likely errors. What do you see your students doing or previous test takers doing that is incorrect, but they seem to really be drawn to it? What is that common mistake? We also only want to use as many distractors as are plausible. Okay? So if you can only think of 2 good distractors or 2 good incorrect options, then only use 2 distractors. We don't want to simply add something in as a placeholder to make sure that we have a certain number of options. We generally recommend that you have the correct answer and then 3 distractors or 3 incorrect answers, or the correct answer and 4 distractors. In making distractors plausible to those who lack knowledge, we want to avoid using silly distractors. So who proposed the theory of relativity? Bart Simpson is a cartoon character. It's likely that he did not propose the theory of relativity, and most examinees are going to be able to simply rule him out. Along the same lines, we want to avoid highly technical distractors or highly technical incorrect options. They're going to stick out to the examinee, and some people are going to select them simply because they think that option is harder, so that it must be the correct answer. So how do I actually know if my distractors are plausible? This is what we can use item statistics for. And we can simply just look at the number of examinees or the percent of examinees that selected each option. So theoretically, back to my theory of relativity question. Let's say 27% selected Isaac Newton, 63% selected Einstein, 10% selected Socrates, and 0% selected Bart Simpson. Nobody chose him. It's a good indicator that option D is not a plausible distractor. It wasn't attractive to anybody, and everybody could rule it out. You can run an item analysis in SoftScore, or also run the exam faculty reports in SoftScore, and this can give you that item analysis, so you can look at the breakdown of your items and see whether or not your distractors were plausible. These are 2 items from one of our exams. In the red box that just appeared up on the screen, you can see in the top row the breakdown, the number of students that selected options A, B, C, D, and E. And then right below that, it actually gives what the percentage is. We want to see that we have some examinees taking all of the options that we have up there. So in our second item here, you might notice only one person selected option E. That distractor is one that we might want to take a harder look at here in our office and see if we can rewrite it to make it more plausible, make it more attractive to some students. Because right now, only one person took it. It might not be, it's probably not a plausible distractor. A similar breakdown can be found in the SoftScore exam faculty reports. Way over on the right-hand side here is the numeric breakdown. 7 people took A, 147 chose B, and so on. Item analysis, like the 2 slides that we just saw, the reports that you can get in SoftScore, is really your best way of determining if the items that you wrote were effective. So back to some guidelines. We want to arrange our alternatives in a logical order, be it chronological, numerical. Some people even organize them based on how long the option is. So what year did the Titanic sink? You'll see we have a bunch of dates in here. It's best just to put them in order. We want to use correct punctuation. So if our stem is an incomplete sentence, then the alternative should be a possible completion of that sentence and not a sentence fragment. The alternatives should also begin with a lowercase and then end with a period. And we've seen examples of this throughout in some of the sample items that have been popping up. If the stem is a question, then our alternatives should begin with a capital letter and end with a period if they're complete sentences. If they're not complete sentences, then you do not need to punctuate them. We also want to be sure not to include any punctuation at the end of the stem. The biggest culprit of this is putting a colon at the end of the stem. We want to avoid doing this unless it's actually grammatically correct. Okay. And 2 more guidelines. The first is we want to use none of the above with caution. Surprisingly, many examinees will not actually view this as a serious option. They'll think that there's no way none of the above can be the correct answer. So we always recommend that if you are going to want to use none of the above in some of your items, then you should make it the obvious correct answer very early on in the test. One of your first, say, 5 items, none of the above should be the correct answer, and it should be a pretty easy item where most people will actually know that none of the above is correct. This helps to establish it as a viable option later on in the test. And we want to avoid using all of the above. And there's a couple reasons for this. The first is an examinee that can rule out one answer as being incorrect will also automatically be able to rule out all of the above. So for example, if I can rule out tomato for multiple reasons as not being a root vegetable, then I can automatically also rule out all of the above. So if I really have no idea what the answer is to this question, I've still given myself a 50-50% chance of guessing correctly. On the other hand, an examinee who knows that 2 alternatives are correct or has a pretty good idea that 2 alternatives are correct now automatically knows that all of the above is the correct answer. So similar item here. And maybe I know that a carrot is a root vegetable, and I have a pretty good idea that a parsnip is a root vegetable. It doesn't matter if I even know what celeriac is. I automatically know that all of the above is correct. Okay. So why do we use these guidelines? Writing test questions is really hard. These guidelines help us to write questions so that they're not going to be misinterpreted. And again, this just helps point us towards that testing ideal, where we have every examinee knows exactly what it is we're asking. The examinees that know the content get the item correct, and the examinees that don't know the content get the item incorrect. Research has also shown that when we write items following these guidelines, they tend to be better quality than items that we write without following any guidelines. When examinees are taking multiple choice tests, we know that they're going to use any strategy possible while taking the tests, and many of these guidelines, as we've seen, have shown how examinees can rule out certain options for different reasons. And so these guidelines help decrease the likelihood of us actually measuring test wiseness or that an examinee has really good test-taking skills. And ultimately, the items or the questions are the individual building blocks of our test, so we want to be sure that we're using quality test items because that's going to be our first step in developing a reliable and valid test. We all spend a lot of time and a big commitment writing our test items and making sure that we're giving good tests to our students or our candidates. So our next step is to use psychometrics or use item analysis to help us decide if our items are actually doing what we want them to do. And this is where the faculty reports that ExamSoft provides are extremely helpful. They can give you some information on exam performance, such as what an average score is on your test and how reliable your test is. They also can break this down further, and you can look at it based on your exam categories or your different skill areas on your test blueprint, and also can get an item analysis, which we saw a very brief example of when we were talking about whether or not distractors are plausible. But these reports actually take this a step further, and this is something that we're going to talk about in an upcoming webinar, a Psychometrics 101 webinar, where a colleague of mine and I are going to talk about conceptually what do we mean by test reliability and validity, how do we measure reliability, how can we use, what is an item analysis, and how can we use that to inform our test writing and our revision. So once we write an item, we put all this time into it, how can we tell if it's doing what we want it to do? And if it's not, how might we revise it to make it perform better? And then we're going to show how we can use these faculty reports from SoftScore to help inform this item writing process and how you can use it as a tool for your test building. Okay. This webinar is happening on Tuesday, February 26th. It's going to be Jim Wallach, the director of our center, and myself, and I believe ExamSoft will be sending out an email invitation sometime in the near future. If you're interested in further reading, the one item example that I gave was from the book by Thomas Haladina. I highly recommend this book. It discusses everything that we talked about today, but it will also give you other types of multiple choice items. It will give you steps for validating these multiple choice items. It's just a very good book if you want to learn more about writing and validating multiple choice items. So I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy schedules today and joining me, and hopefully you're able to pick up some tips that you can use in the future when you're writing your multiple choice questions and exams. I believe we may have some time for questions. Carter, I'm not sure if you're still on the line.
Yes. Yeah, we've got a few questions.
Sure.
Let me see. Okay, there's one that is in regards to the test blueprint. If the test questions are integrated, for example, more than one objective is covered per question, then what should the % of coverage be?
So
and
generally, right. So generally, if we're dealing with that type of blueprint, we want to look at them as maybe there's an overall objective and then there's sub-objectives underneath in that. And so then in that case, your test blueprint still would add up to 100%. If that is not the case, if it's not possible to do it that way, you may want to consider having one be what your primary objective is and then having a secondary objective and create your percentages based on the primary objective. That is a possibility as well.
Very cool. Thank you, Sonia. Another is regarding superfluous information. What if part of the goal is to have students know what information is actually pertinent? This question is coming from someone who writes case-based questions with complex patient profiles.
Right. So in that's actually a really excellent example of a case where that information may not actually be superfluous. What you're actually probably testing is somebody can read through a case file and pull out the relevant information. Superfluous information, we really want to look at that as these kind of standard multiple choice items where we have a very short stem and 4 or 5 options. If you're asking if part of your content that you're testing or what you're interested in is the ability that somebody can extract the relevant information because, say, they're going to be doing this in a clinical setting, or they're taking tests for like therapy and they need to be able to pull out relevant information from case files, then you would expect that information to be in there. And it's superfluous, but your ultimate goal is to test that they can weed through that information.
Very cool. Thank you, Sonia, again. And then one more.
Sure.
Do you have any thoughts that you could share about using multiple choice or objective questions to measure higher order Bloom's levels?
Right. So I get this question a lot. And that is, I believe, one of the reasons those complex multiple choice items where you have 3 or 4 statements and then you're asked to respond 1 or 2, 2 and 3. That's why those were originally developed, to try to get at those complex thought processes. So that is one way to do it. It is difficult sometimes to get towards the more complex things, higher order Bloom's taxonomy with multiple choice items. They're going to be items that are more difficult to write. So sometimes, depending on the goal of your assessment, multiple choice items may not be the best fit. You may be looking at something more of an essay type question for those.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for coming. We're about out of time now, and again, for the 3rd time, thank you, Sonia. Again, I do apologize for the sound issues that happened at the beginning, but I'm glad that everybody stuck around. Just to let you know, I will send out an email sometime very soon, possibly tomorrow, that'll have a link to this webinar as a recording, and it'll also have like a link to where you can just see the PowerPoint presentation itself. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.